Excellent. Thank you for hitting the switch, Emily. Appreciate that very much. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kim Smythe. I'm President and CEO of the Greater Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce. I'm your moderator today. My job is to stay out of the way of the facilitators and to handle the Q&As if we have time at the end. If we have urgent questions come up in the middle, I'll certainly step in and address the speaker with the question. So please use the chat box to enter your questions and we'll go from there. I'd like to acknowledge, first of all, that we are on the unceded traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically Snuneymuxw, Tsuut'ina, and Sundaws, and I pay our respect for that. Both our panelists have tremendous experience and a deep background in our topic today, cybersecurity. Walter Anderson is in Nanaimo here with us, and he's the virtual Chief Information Security Officer for the Nanaimo Port Authority. Walter develops and deploys corporate and enterprise-wide security programs and security strategies. He leads and participates with management and C-suite executives in the overall security and functionality of information systems, IT infrastructure, and core business applications. As a thought leader with regards to securing the enterprise, security awareness, and the ever-evolving changes of the cyber threat landscape, Walter communicates with the entire organization about the methods cyber criminals use to gain access and how their actions can lead to a data breach. So Walter will be giving us local perspective on this. I want to point out also that Walter is a past chair of the Nanaimo Chamber of Commerce. Our other speaker today is Ron Borsholm. Ron is with MNP in their cybersecurity department here in BC. He's coming to us from south of the Malahat today. Ron's got over 11 years experience with payment card compliance, working as an assessor and senior project manager, technical architect, assisting the BC government attain PCI compliance. Ron's a great storyteller. Ron has spoken with us before and presented in the past. I'm really looking forward to his presentation today. His slide deck is great. I got to preview it last night. So Ron, why don't you start off? Take it away.
Great. Thanks very much. I'll just quickly share my screen here. Hopefully that's visible to everybody. So thanks again for asking me to present today. I think the topic is pretty relevant given everything happening in the world with social engineering, COVID, all the rest of the other changes have led to the ability for bad actors, threat actors to actually compromise companies through ransomware, these other avenues. So one of the things we really have noticed in the last year to 2 years is that, even though large organizations are still being attacked, we're starting to see more and more smaller organizations get attacked from these threat actors, and the impacts that obviously happen on a smaller company are much more devastating than what they are to a larger company, mainly because of limited resources to respond to an attack, and also having the funds available to actually hire expertise to help when something bad happens. Some of the things that I've noticed, and this came out of the Canadian Internet Registration Authority, known as CIRA, they did a review, and it's strictly just Canadian data, and this will kind of relate to other parts of the presentation, but they found that 71% of organizations still do not have a formal patching policy. So basically making sure servers, workstations, firewalls, these kind of things have adequate patching in place to prevent vulnerabilities that would allow a person to potentially breach an organization. They also found that 30% of companies did not have anti-malware protection installed. They may have had antivirus, but they weren't covered with what we call anti-malware, which actually looks for things like ransomware, these kind of applications that potentially could get installed into a network architecture. And probably the biggest problem that I saw out of the report is that only 54% of the small businesses provide any kind of cybersecurity training to their employees. And if you think about it, your employees are really the front door to your organization. If you can't compromise them, most likely you can compromise the organization. one
Just
of
wanted
the
to
things,
comment on that for you a second, Ron, if you just wanted to pop back a slide there. And just, I noticed that uh, locally here, that number of businesses, various sizes and members of the chamber are typically smaller organizations and some of the more corporate enterprise companies. And in most cases, it's done from a local IT company. There's usually a managed services agreement, or the IT company is available for updates and patches on an as-needed basis. But I agree with you that there is no formal, a lot of organizations don't have a scheduled patching policy. They just sort of, well, does updates show up, we get them done, that type of thing. Exactly. A lot of applications aren't being done. And when it comes to anti-malware, things, the most common one I think most people are familiar with is something like Malwarebytes, and there's a number of other products out there. And they can be costly just for subscription. Others are fairly reasonable and even free. So, and there's caution on using anything that's free, of course, because there is a price tag on free support. And then when it comes to cybersecurity training, I think you're referring to phishing testing email phishing. Is that correct?
Across the board, phishing, you name it. There's a whole pile of entry points that could, be leveraged to get to an employee. We even do things as drop USB keys in an organization to see if somebody will plug it in to a computer. And obviously, if they do, it's got a call home feature, which would then notify us that that computer, we can now access it.
Yeah, which is a sort of a form of social engineering, is it not?
Yes.
The curiosity, human nature of what's on this. I wonder what this does.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, I have great comments because we see this across the board all the time. So to give you an idea, related to that social engineering, with this kind of report that came out in July this past summer, if you look at the bottom, when they looked at February 2020, there were only about 5,000 phishing attacks happening per week. In April of that year, less than 6 months later, it went up to 200,000. So it just shows that attack avenue is being used more and more on organizations worldwide.
Yeah, I read an article just recently about one of the largest scale attacks, and interesting enough, it wasn't just targeting the corporate organization or the servers or the people who work there. This was attacking all of the members. And what they did is it was 30,000 people they sent a malware and phishing attacks to and targeted and demanded ransomware from 30,000 members of this organization. Now, we don't have anything like that here locally, but just to give you an idea, if that was to happen, it's not just the businesses that are at risk, it's the people working from home, and then anybody who's a member can be exploited personally. Correct?
Exactly. Yep. Yeah, exactly. We have this happen all the time. I think we have, within our MNP Digital Incident Response Group, we have probably 2 calls from clients a week that have been hit with ransomware. Well, I'll talk about, those kind of avenues later in the slides. So
okay.
To kind of, everybody talks about this happening, but a lot of people don't understand the background to, how the ecosystem works. So a lot of people have actually heard of what's called the dark web. I usually do a little bit of background on this because there's actually 3 levels to the internet. One is the surface web, which is something, which has a named address. So like facebook.com, google.com, these kind of things. That's all kind of publicly visible global traffic. It only really accounts for about 4% of actual internet traffic. The next level down is what's called the deep web. And the deep web is more about, confidential data. You see a lot of business transaction running through this level. This level doesn't have a name like a Facebook or a Google. It strictly relates to the IP addresses. So you would log into an API, whatever that IP address is directly. And then beneath that, there's what's called the deep dark web. And this is what people hear about on the news. The dark web was actually built by the US government as a way for spies to communicate, from a foreign country back to the United States without being found and being compromised. So the way the dark web really works is every time a person moves from computer to computer through the web to get to a dark website, it's actually encrypting and re-encrypting every time it moves. It's also dropping its tail. So it's very, very hard to identify who the person is using what's known as a Tor browser in the dark web. And of course, this is the underground where everybody sells things. It's the clearinghouse for stolen goods and materials, whether it's Bitcoin, guns, whatever you want is down there. Won't go into the details because it does get very ugly with some of the things that are there, including child pornography. There's cases where people were kidnapping girls in Europe and selling them in the dark web on a dark market, these kind of things. So even though, we thought in 2020 we were starting to win the fight against the dark web sites, it's actually turning around, and there's becoming even more and more of them. Every time they shut down one, there's usually more. The most famous dark web in history is what was called the Silk Road. There used to be a really good movie on Netflix that talked about the rise of the Silk Road, how it was built, how people used it. If it's not a great clear picture here, but you see at the top left, there's 484 actual listings for drugs, everything from prescription to cannabis, you name it. What people would do would go in here, they would make their order, they would use Bitcoin, and then they would have it shipped to some different location. So Silk Road was the original. It's been shut down. It took years and years for the FBI to actually find the person that was running it. And he made one little mistake and exposed what we would call his surface email address. And that allowed the FBI to start narrowing in on who the actual person was that was doing this. But obviously they made millions and millions of dollars using this platform.
Yeah. I like your analogy there of the iceberg in the previous slide there. There was, where the surface web is just something, the internet, that everybody thinks that's the internet, right? But then the deep web and then the dark web, and it's the Tor browser, the anonymity of using a browser that allows this type of unscrupulous type of activity to occur. And it's easy for people to cover their tracks. And I'm sure you're going to get into it, but a lot of the transactions these days that take place are using cryptocurrency, and as it's difficult to trace and easily laundered, and difficult, obviously, to track. So, yeah, go on, please.
Exactly. So what are things worth on the dark web? So I just focused on basically access points. So, if you're looking for just credentials, simple ones, you can almost get those free. Facebook, I can get a Facebook access for $1. Credit cards are going between about $5 and $15 each for an actual verified credit card. One of the interesting ones, when you see medical records at $50 plus, that's got to do more with the American side, not Canadian, because in the US, every health group actually works independently and they don't share records. In Canada, we have a centralized platform, so you can't bill BC and Alberta and get paid twice, whereas in the US, if you break your leg and you get all of these records, you can actually fake bill 10 different insurance companies, get paid out 10 times. So that's why the medical records are worth the money. But obviously email accounts, and this is more about targeted people within an organization. So board members, C-suite, upper management. Two other areas that they pay attention to are HR, because HR, if they can compromise email there, they can learn everything about the internal workings of the company, and who the people, who the players are, and then set up a more staged, dedicated attack through those emails.
So Ron, as a small business owner, and I have a small number of employees, and I work out of a single location, and I may be in construction, or I may be in retail, or some other industry sector. What concern would I have? I'm just a little guy. Why would somebody want my identity?
So I'll give you a really, hopefully under a 1-minute example. I did a presentation about 1.5 years ago to the wineries in the Okanagan. And at the end of it, I talked about phishing, and one of the owners of a winery came up to me afterwards to chat. And apparently he, from the sounds of it, his email was compromised and the bad actor was reading everything. And this person was going to a winery conference in the States, and he told his manager that he was going to be down there, he was going to go to different places and buy things for the coming year. So the emails basically started going back to this manager saying how great the conference was. He just listened to such and such speak. He had just gone out, he talked to a company, and he asked his manager to, basically wire transfer $400,000 to buy all of these winery, casks or whatever they were. And of course, the manager did that because it sounded absolutely legit. And then when the actual owner got back and was told that the manager had wired $400,000, he had not sent that. His email had been compromised. The person learned how the person wrote the emails and was basically able to masquerade and pull off something like that. So it does happen quite often, and it can be very devastating, especially when your money just disappears.
And I guess, if you were a small business organization, less than 100, less than 50, maybe less than 20 employees, and you came to the office one day and your employees are in a panic and they've got this message on the screen, and your organization isn't a multi-million-dollar organization, and you don't have $400,000 or $500,000 to pay a ransomware, but they're asking for $10,000 or $20,000. Oh, your computer's going to be locked down. So do you think people will pay the ransomware to keep the business operational so they can continue the cash flow and keep business? Or do you think, they'll just, what choice do they have? I mean, if I pay the $20,000, I can get back in business within 72 hours or whatever the time frame is on the limit. It's obviously in Bitcoin. They want the money and whatever the value is on the market. And maybe the amount is less, but it is a denomination that I can afford this. Maybe my insurance will cover it because I did get cyber insurance, or maybe I don't have it. But the point is, do you think, and that's the big debate, is do businesses pay the ransomware to keep going, or do they not pay it and hopefully they have a method for recovering their information?
So that's actually, I'm going to address that in a couple of slides here, because I think that's.
I'm getting ahead of you, I'm sorry.
Pretty good. So we are going to jump into phishing. So obviously phishing is just one element of social engineering. There's many, many other avenues that can occur. There's different types of phishing. So spear phishing is a term when they go after specific individuals in a company. Another term is whaling, where they go after the actual owner's executive and board level. So depending on who they're going after, there's different level of efforts that actually will be, made by these bad actors. This is kind of an example, even though M&P has got very good spam filters detection. Apparently, it's not just people in Nigeria that win, $100 million in the lottery, but people over here in Ireland are just the same way. And they're really happy to share money because they were going to give me $1 million US, but this actually even made it through M&P's portal. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, your people are your front line of defense. So if this had had a link or anything to click to, that could have led to a problem. So being aware of what is in a phishing email is really important. One of the things that we've definitely found, and this is a recent study from about the last 3 or 4 months, but the types of phishing attacks have changed, because 3, 4 years ago, it was always don't open the attachment because the attachment was the problem. What's really happening now is within the emails, having an embedded link where it says click here to access something, that accounts for about 68% of the emails that are sent. Data entry is another one, like fill in a field with information, that's about 23%. Only about 9% of the actual phishing emails now actually include attachments. So that's something that's just kind of, you know, going away while the other two are more evolving. And during COVID, the top 5 kind of used themes in the phishing emails. One is obviously a new Microsoft Teams request. Second is a coronavirus alert. So here's our organization. Here's a change to our on-site protocols. You know, click here for additional information. These kind of things. So it does rely on the work from home a little bit more. This is kind of like how we do it. Real world example. So when M&P does we're hired by an organization to do a phishing attack against an organization to see how vulnerable they are. We'll actually send an email that says, you know, we're basically changing our IT security policies, and we need to ensure all of our staff are adhering to the proper, you know, password strength. And we'll send something like this. And again, you notice it's got a click here to check your password strength. What then happens is you go to a landing page, and some of the things here are pretty noticeable, like that Intel logo, that's from 10 years ago. That's not used anymore, but it'll basically go, how strong is your password? And you type in your password, click grade, and what it'll do is it'll usually send you back a message that says everything's good. You don't have to do anything else. But what we've now done is we have your email and we have your password attached to it. We recently did like a social engineering attack against a company, and this is almost the same for any mid-sized company that we deal with. Smaller companies, usually even worse, but in this case, we targeted 500 employees. We send a link out at the beginning of the week asking them to confirm the password. We send a follow-up email later in the week with more emphasis saying, you know, we have to report to senior management next week. Please get this done immediately, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found in this particular one was 51% of the people in this company actually clicked the link. And that could have led to ransomware, malicious software being installed in a computer. What's pretty common is we usually see between about 25 and 40% of an organization in this particular scenario actually give us their passwords. So we will get everything from board members, C-suite, you know, down to managers, to your, you know, your average employee. Why that's important is, why do you need to break through a firewall to get to confidential information? If I can read the CEO's or board's email, that can provide me a ton of information about what the company's doing and provide opportunities for attacks.
Yeah, and it just kind of compare that to like a small business owner where, you know, it's my wife and I, and we have some family working for us, and we have hired a few employees, and you know, we run a business, we make a good living, and you know, Myers Morris Penny's got the digital's got a great, you know, firm with lots of services, including penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, and you know, that phishing kind of testing. Like, what can a small business do? You know, when you only have a handful of employees, you know, and would an M&P engage, you know, and what would, you know, kind of would that be possible for somebody to get, you know, phishing testing done, you know, reasonably, or would you recommend like a subscription service where, you know, you can set up your own campaign from a, you know, and send out multiple emails and check your employees to see if they are actually alert and paying attention to what they're clicking on?
Yeah, exactly. And there are, KnowBe4 is one of the common platforms, but you have to realize those are kind of canned approaches. What we do is do what a real attacker would do. So we look at how an IT director actually writes emails, like how do they address people, how do they sign their emails, how do they write, and we tailor it basically the same as an attacker would. When you work with the other sort of canned projects, they're more canned emails, so they tend to be a lot easier to spot than what we would do. Usually when we do these, the IT directors aren't very happy with us because everybody gets mad at them, because it came from the IT director, and they say, well, that was no fair, it came from you. And actually that's the point, it wasn't me. So how did you know? We gave you 5-6 hints in the email that you should have been able to spot this was not a proper email. It came from the wrong email address. There was spelling mistakes, all of these kind of things. So, the bottom line is you should be doing it. There are even some free resources out there. But, as an organization, this is the front door. And if people leave the front door open by clicking a link or, entering information, that's what leads to the problems. And then if you have had your email breached, this website is actually really interesting. And I recommend everybody just go try it for fun, but it's called Have I Been Pawned? So make sure you spell pawn, P-W-N-E-D, because the bad guys actually got the P-A-W-N-E-D domain. So if you go to the wrong one, you're not actually on this site. But for instance, as an example, I typed in my very old shaw.ca email, and it actually says that email is associated with 7 data breaches in the past. And when I go into detail here, it will actually give you which breaches my email address was stolen in. So years ago, LinkedIn was breached. It made the news, but really they didn't lose much information. This is a breach that happened in the first half of 2021. And if you look at the bottom there, compromised data, they actually captured education level, email, your gender, your location, job titles, names, social media profiles. They lost a lot more information in this one. And these are what the bad guys will actually turn around and start to recreate your identity with this knowledge. So it's a great website. If you haven't heard of it, go try it out. It's usually a bit of an eye opener.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned some movies on Netflix, and I'm a fan of podcasting, and I like podcasts. And there's a podcast out there called Darknet Diaries. Have you heard of it, Ron?
Yeah.
They've got some great stories on there. One of them is how LinkedIn was breached and how it happened. And it's an interesting, as well. It talks about the Silk Road and other stories on podcasts and some of the other, major or global child pornography rings that were brought down, and story behind that and how it began. And I like it because he tells it in a really good narrative fashion, makes it interesting and spooky. And if that's a thing you liked in it, in stories, then I would recommend, kind of Google Darknet Diaries and then check it out for yourself. And then it helps you understand the real scope of this and how far and wide it reaches, and how it affects organizations.
Exactly. So what's the result of the social engineering? In many cases, I think it's about 98% now, social engineering is the entry to ransomware. So by being able to compromise an environment and email, they're able to get ransomware into an organization. There's also what's called they call it post-intrusion ransomware. So they actually breach into your environment through your email, and then that allows them to actually load ransomware into the environment. There was a university back east that they actually compromised the university's email system, and they were actually able to sell ransomware as an attachment to every faculty member and every student on the campus. And they had to literally shut down the entire campus for a week to clean their systems to get back to, an operational status. One of the things that this slide actually made me pay attention to that. If you look on the right, it was 2019 data. So basically between 29 and 2020, there wasn't much of a difference between the number of organizations that agreed to pay a ransom. So initially they got the ransomware attack, they were asked for $40,000. What really changed that people need to be aware of is that only 2% of those ransomware attacks involved the threat actor coming back, and after they'd been paid the initial amount, they actually came back and asked for more money. And that actually in 2020 grew from 2% to 32%. So the original business model that they used was ransom you, they pay, they give you the keys, and on to the next victim. And the reason they did that is because you had a fairly high confidence that if you paid the ransom, you would get your keys. Now what's happening is you pay, but they come back and ask for more money before you get the keys, or they'll give you part of the keys, half the keys if they've ransom, basically attack multiple systems. They may give you keys for only some of it. They even start charging now ransomware by gigabyte of data encrypted. So instead of, hey, we'll just unlock your systems, they'll charge you by how many gigs of data they have managed to encrypt and secure that you can no longer get to. So it's just something to be aware of, that even if you do pay the ransomware, you may end up having them come back to ask for even more money.
And what's happening now, and that's what I've heard too as well, is that it's not just encrypting your data on your systems. They've been into your network and you, without your knowledge, exfiltrated sensitive information. So they're taking like even if they think, well, if you have your backups and you don't pay us and you restore your data and get your systems back up, we have your information and we're going to release it into the internet, make it public for everybody to see, including salaries and personal identification and maybe health records and things like that. So you better pay us, and that's now your data is not just encrypted, but it's also being held hostage on a public site that with a click of a button, everybody in the world gets access to it, or they sell it for the highest bidder.
And there's also cases where if you don't clean your systems after you pay for the ransomware, they can actually leave other malware in the system that will just lock it up again in 6 to 9 months. So it's really important when you do have a ransomware attack that you go into the systems, you either rebuild them or clean them appropriately. So I'll kind of walk you through an actual case study. This happened within the last year over in Port Moody, directly relatable to the audience because it was a small company. I think they have five employees here. The event didn't actually start on Monday morning. It started on the weekend when the owner of the company tried to remote log into his office server and he couldn't get a connection. And he just thought it was a bad internet problem, whatever, and he'd deal with it Monday. So he went in on Monday and absolutely everything was locked. He got, ironically, the blue screen of death is being used by the hackers, which, is a comedic kind of parallel to the old Microsoft blue screens when everything blew up. But as in this case, everything, he had VoIP phone, so he lost his email, his phones, his workstation servers, everything was offline. What was really interesting about this case was that his single IT support person was actually on vacation on the other side of the world. And so he was little to no help at all. This person, when we interviewed him for this, he basically, prioritized his original thoughts. And the first thought was, am I out of business? Am I finished? And then a second one was, are we going to lose customers? Like, how damaging is this going to be to us? And ironically, the third question was, how much is this going to cost me? So he's more concerned about survival before the cost. When they did get into the ransomware, because there was literally nothing that he could do, he could not recover. So he didn't have backups. He didn't have information that would help him recover. So he basically was forced to pay $45,000 in Bitcoin. And again, this was a pay per gigabyte data scenario. So that's how they came up with the 45,000. By the time he paid the ransom, he got the keys, fixed all the systems. It actually turned into about a $90,000 exercise to mostly recover. That was almost all the systems back up and running. Another finding he found during the recovery, and a lot of people don't realize this, is it isn't just like a password and it works again. If the ransomware is encrypted at what we call the bit level, the smallest level of storage on a hard drive, it can take a long time for the unencrypt process to actually work. It may take up to a week. So in this case, he was shut down for 5 full business days, and he was a week and a half before he was fully back online, operational. Some of the challenges he spoke to was, one of the things that hurt really at the beginning is he really didn't have any documentation that was current on his environment. So what the workstations were, what the servers were, how they connected, what the operating systems were. He didn't really have a lot of documentation around that. So it was really difficult to get started again. He immediately noticed, because, it's a small company, almost like a just-in-time environment. So his sales and cash flow were immediately impacted. And he wasn't sure how long this was going to last. So because it was a very small company in the middle of COVID, not a lot of revenues, he actually laid off some of his staff immediately because he just didn't know what to do. He also talked about physical stress, not being able to sleep in the first 48 hours because he was just completely running on adrenaline, which led him to being what he called punch drunk, less able to really respond to the issues clearly. It took him about 3 to 4 weeks to physically recover, to get back to normal sleep patterns, let the stress kind of die down. He also noted that one thing we don't talk about is there's no downtime. So once you do, pay a ransom, if you are able to get up and running again, if you've been down for a week, you've got business catch up. So you got to go back and catch up on everything from the previous week to the point where you should be today. So that was, again, he didn't just recover and go back to normal 8-hour days. He was doing a lot of long days to catch up. He said also, he did notice long-term health impacts just because it was such a stressful event. His life savings are in this company. If it's gone, everything's gone. So he did speak to that. His recommendations really were, and you kind of noted to that, Walter, about, evaluate your service providers and ask the right questions. Do you have 24/7 coverage? Do they have backup coverage? What are they actually doing for you? Get them to document everything very clearly. Be proactive. So most businesses don't invest to ensure they're protected. You should, look at your environments, figure out where you should spend money. Use effort to protect yourself. And his name, his comment after was, use a well-known or experienced service provider. Get recommendations on who you're using, because if you've got the wrong one, and we do a lot of third-party reviews for our clients on their service providers, and 50% of those reviews don't come back very favorable. And then it's up to the organization to decide to hold that service provider accountable or move to a new service provider that'll take better care of them. And then basically have somebody independent come in and look at the environment, because you may think you know how everything works, but once you get somebody come in and actually ask questions, you may find out you didn't know how it fully worked, and there may be holes.
In this case, Ron, did M&P, parachute in with an incident response team and take over? I mean, those are services that M&P offers, and there are other organizations that also, FireEye and a number of other that are, in the news. You hear them all the time. But did that take place? And do you think the owner had insurance? And if he had insurance, that would have helped? And could he have gotten cybersecurity insurance? What's the requirements for getting that? And are the premiums too steep for most businesses?
Yeah, hopefully that's kind of like this last slides here on cyber. So hopefully we get to those. But you're absolutely right. What happens a lot of in cases with our clients is they're actually accounting clients. And every time one of our accountants goes, hey, company XYD just contacted me and asked me if we kept any of the documentation from the last audit we did, that's usually a flag that they've lost their data or lost their ability to get to their data. And they're trying to rebuild, say, their accounts receivable ledger, and they're asking us if we have copies of that. So they do reach out. We do help them. One of the first things that we do in a cyber incident, just so people are aware, is we recommend, legal counsel. We can either recommend a company or they can get their own. The reason we do that is we want that company to talk to legal lawyer, then talk to us. The reason is if you do end up with legal action later and that company spoke to us directly, if there's a lawsuit, we can then be pulled in as people to provide evidence. If we're doing it through a lawyer process between lawyer between us and the client, then there's attorney-client privilege, and that excludes us. So in some cases, companies may have been negligent, didn't do the right thing, but they don't want to disclose it because of lawsuit. So this is just something that happens. So usually what we do is we work with a company first, try to figure out, do they need a legal, if it's a really big breach that involved a lot of information, then we get involved with privacy officers in the different provinces. We've had breaches that span the world, so we end up having to get legal consult in the US to deal with US clients about a breach, especially if there's loss of confidential information. So yeah, it's a bit of a proactive, but hiring a company that does incident response, the immediate effect is things will go from stock to lightning speed because we know what we need to do. We know how to help you, and we just get on with it and go. And time's money, right? So the longer a company's down, the more money they're going to lose, and the more damage that happens. So we'll quickly jump into some of the prevention because we're going to quickly run out of time here. But some of the key things, as I mentioned before, is training awareness. If you're not training your staff to be aware of cyber issues, these kind of things, they'll keep the front door open. So two of the key things on training is leadership has to be involved, whether it's a small company, a large company. If leadership's involved and says we're marching this way, this is the way you need to be involved, you need to help, they're much more successful. Also, within an organization, there's different kind of roles. So from a really small 2-3 person up to say a 50-person organization, you can personalize training depending on who those people are, whether they're frontline, those kind of things. Training should include at a minimum, obviously, phishing, how to create and maintain strong passwords. Don't click the links. Confirmation that confidential information should not be taken out of the company. You really should have policies and procedures about what your staff can and can't do, and that needs to be communicated to them. We talked about this a little bit earlier about the patching. So, the recent one just came out September 13th from Apple, and they updated, it came out as updated software for iPhones. But what happened was there was actually malware that looked at this critical vulnerability in Apple, and it was basically surveillance software that they could actually turn on your iPhone and see you through your camera. They could listen to everything you say through your microphone, and this led to one of the rare, kind of global notifications from Apple. You need to do this upgrade immediately for this patch. What they really didn't tell you was it also applied to iPads and it also applied to Apple TV. So all three share the same OS. You needed to actually patch all of them. And a lot of people were just patching their iPhone, forgetting that their iPad was vulnerable as well as their home TV. when we talked about the managed services, absolutely, small companies, it's getting really hard to find people in IT to provide support. It's becoming a lot of single person companies, especially smaller towns. It's just difficult to get resources. So, working with a managed service provider can really work, but if you don't have those, the ability to do that, you really have to pay attention to your systems, because if you're not checking for missing patches, those vulnerabilities, those are just open gateways to an attacker to get through. And I kind of put this one there, this little diagram is trying to prove your cybersecurity posture without an accurate asset inventory. Most companies don't even have a list of what their devices are, what the serial numbers are, what the operating system is, and what the patch level is. Most companies don't even have that. So without knowing that, it's really hard to improve, your posture with related to cybersecurity attacks. Another one that we highly recommend, and it's becoming more and more, predominant out there. Most banks use it, but using multi-factor authentication. Even if you're using your Shaw email, you have the ability to do multi-factor authentication to it. I recently got a notification from RBC that somebody was actually trying to get into my bank account through a website. So somebody somewhere has managed to get my bank account number. And I suspect it was my daughter lost her purse, and in that purse, it's got her bank account card, which is part of our family account. So I got a notification that somebody was trying to get in, but they weren't able to because I have multi-factor. Without that, without them having my phone to basically approve that login, nobody can get in there. So a lot of different applications, vendors, services all use multi-factor, and I strongly, kind of state you should use some kind of multi-factor authentication. Although I don't think I've got the slide in here, but I'll speak to it really quickly now. For the first time, what they're calling it is a deep voice. People are kind of familiar with the deep video, where they, basically can take somebody's picture and recreate them doing something. In the United Immigrants, I believe it was, they actually recorded a vice president of an organization's voice and then let AI learn it. And then they used AI to call people at the company and saying, hey, it's the boss. Can you wire transfer this money? And I believe they were actually successful to the point of about $25 million, because the person getting the phone calls absolutely believed it was the person on the other end. It wasn't a computer and AI, basically responding to questions. So again, multi-factor, there's different ways to do it, from USB sticks to, phones, these kind of things, biometrics. But, it's definitely something, if you can use it in your environment, even personally, you should be using it. One of the biggest things we see with companies that we work with is nobody's got a plan. If you get hit, we still have this mentality that it will never happen to me. And then when it does, nobody knows what to do. So, basically having a proper incident response plan in place. If you get hit with ransomware, if something happens, it's kind of just like a physical disaster. If you've got an organization, there's a fire, you should have a fire protocol. It's the same thing with IT. If you have a laptop stolen, for example, do you have a plan for that? We had an engagement about 2 years ago where a person lost a laptop on the weekend, went for a picnic with his wife and daughter, came back to his car, window was broken, laptop was gone. And on Friday, he had downloaded every client's credit card number to that laptop, and it was unencrypted and not traceable. So a year and a half later, they still have a laptop out there with this information on it potentially that could land in the wrong person's hand. I'm a bad one for going to flea markets and buying used phones for 15 bucks, because I just hook them up and log in. I go, oh, here's all his pictures, here's all his contacts, especially older phones, they're a treasure trove for information. So again, having an incident response plan in place, it should dictate who does what. Key things are, again, like I mentioned, having a legal team, also having a communications person who speaks to the media. If it's become public, who speaks on behalf of the company. I had a breach with the BC government when I was doing their payment card compliance project. And in the third year, we had, this is very relevant to Vancouver Island. You may remember somebody stole the parking kiosk at Goldstream Park, just outside of Victoria at the Malhat there. And it became public, and a reporter went to 3 different levels of government and said, so what's up with this? Was any credit card stolen? And 3 government officials gave 3 different answers. And that led to them being front and center on BCTV News that night. Made the government look really, really bad. Ironically, just as a little inside info, that was the year that our premier was very gracious and made parking at all provincial parks free, because they realized that these parking kiosks had hard drives that were recording the cardholder data, and they didn't know if every card was still in there from 15 years. So the response was they chopped down every payment kiosk, made parking free that year, and next year Christie came back with brand new payment kiosks that are solar powered, cellular encrypted devices, very little chance of breach. But that's kind of like an inside story of what happens in the background. One of the other things a company can do, it tends to be a bit more expensive for a very small company, but do what's called a maturity threat risk assessment. So this is when a company, like MNP, we do a pile of these for organizations. But we do is we come in and look to a 360 on an organization. It's based on what's called the SANS 21 critical controls. Look at all aspects of your company. Where's your critical data? What are the highest risk areas? And then we provide a report back. And other organizations do this as well. But that allows you to look at where your risk is, where you should focus your time, effort, dollars, to enhance your security. But, face it, you could just keep spending money and money and money. At a certain point, you get to where you're okay with the risk. And that's really where you need to get to.
I just wanted to mention, I know we're running short on time, that for a lot of businesses, they may want to do a self-assessment, and just as a preliminary step before engaging a company to do a cyber maturity matrix or study, and go really in depth, and then what can you do as a small business or organization to take steps to protect yourself? And what comes to my mind, and maybe if you comment on this, it'd be great for the rest of the viewers here, is that the Center for Cybersecurity has got published. It's the Canadian government, and there's the top 10. Do these top 10 things, and you will be more safer than most other organizations. If you can do even some of them, you're better off than others who haven't even started. So, and I guess creating a plan, but even doing a self-assessment, start with an inventory.
Yeah.
Inventory of your equipment, your software, your licensing. Where's your data? What have you got for backup systems? Are they functioning? Do a self audit or self-assessment, and then take it to the next level, like engage someone like your organization, Ron, like MNP, to do a much more thorough assessment if that's needed by your organization structure.
Yeah. Usually we ask 2 things right at the beginning. One is, what is the critical data? Where is it? Where does it reside? And then the second one is, what are the processes that access that critical data? Because that's the road that an attacker will follow. So unless you understand that, all the rest of it's kind of presenting a fog, right? Because if you don't know what to protect and you spend all this money, are you really protecting it? You're not sure. You may have copies of data that go from one point to another point. They copy a bunch of information that moves from, say, a server to a workstation. Well, do you know that? You know, you have to follow that trail. Who does what with what? And that really will help explain what your risks are and then apply it to that. So I always close my my slide deck with this little thing from Kevin Mitnick, and obviously a little bit more gray hair. This goes back a while, but I remember Kevin from years and years ago, and I actually got to meet him in Vancouver a couple of years ago. And he's a really interesting guy because, you know, as he always wears his black and white shirt, you know, says he's not a hacker, yet he's known as the world's most foremost and known hacker. And he always says, I never hacked. I never broke into a computer. I never broke through a firewall. What I always did was I found somebody in a company to give me the login credentials. And once he got the credentials, that's when he started snooping through the systems. Ironically, he started this at a very young age in San Francisco. You know, it was summer. He didn't want to pay for the buses to travel around. So he found at the bus yard the dumpster where they threw all those old ticket books that they used to punch, you know, the locations in. And he found where those were. And so he went in, snuck in, you know, gathered up bags of these things. And then he was able to get one of the people on the bus, one of the drivers, to tell him where to get the bus, the key punch, like where to go get it from. And so he managed to get the key punch. Then he figured out the algorithms, and he and his friends rode the buses for free the entire summer. So again, you know, this is kind of a social engineering approach, but he's very adamant about, you know, I never broke in. I just asked to get in, and people gave me the key. And you know, that's how he got into most of these systems. So it's really interesting that nothing's really changed in 20 years. It's still the same approach. It's just technology's advanced to make it so much easier. You know, I can send out emails to 100,000 people in 10 minutes, you know, with a ransomware attachment to it. And, you know, you couldn't do that 10 years ago. It would be very difficult to do. It'd be noticed right away if your server started to chug with all these outbound emails. You'd notice that in a couple of minutes, hopefully. But, you know, so that's basically just, you know, kind of the presentation here. You know, we've only got a couple of minutes. Any questions?
I did have a question from one of our viewers, and it might take a psychologist to provide the appropriate answer instead of one of you gentlemen, but why would a person pay ransom instead of paying for a service to clean it up, to fix it, to make it well again?
Bottom line is we probably can't do anything. You know, when you're ransomware, it involves an encryption key, and we don't have the key. There's two parts to the key, and if you don't have both of them, you can't unencrypt. There's absolutely nothing we can do. So normally, you know, the first question was, do you have a backup? And there's all sorts of issues around backups. If you back up your computer to an attached USB drive, hard drive, the malware will jump to that USB drive very easily. So now your backup's encrypted as your primary. The other thing that we see happening is there's what we would call the kiddie, you know, attackers, the junior guys and the more mature guys. The more mature guys will get ransomware into your environment, and they'll wait. They'll wait 10 months, they'll wait a year before they invoke it to actually ransom the computer. The reason they do that is the traditional recovery is take last night's backup and try to restore it. A lot of times, you know, a few years back, that would work. If that didn't work, then we go back a week's backup. What they're doing now is if they have the ransomware in there from 10 months ago, you restore that backup and the ransomware immediately locks the computer. Again, it's very hard to clean it out. And then it becomes a question of not recovering the system. But if you've lost 10 months of your data that you can't access because your backups are corrupt with ransomware, then it becomes, are you willing to pay for the 10 months of data you've lost? Some companies choose to start over. A lot of small companies have to do that because you know, the ransomware. The other thing I should note, you know, this has become such a big business. You can actually go to very specific companies, and they'll actually act on your behalf to negotiate with the ransomware guys, to negotiate the price down. So they'll go, 400,000. This company only makes 100,000. We can only afford 20. We'll pay you 20. Is that okay? And the bad guys may go, yeah, okay. We'll take 20 and we'll give you the keys. Other cases, they go, no, pay us full amount or nothing. So it'd be great to say we could help everybody and recover. The reality is by the time you actually are ransomware, there's not a lot you can do. It's recovery. So hopefully backups. I actually, it sounds funny. I tell small companies, print physically their accounts payable and accounts receivable ledgers, physically keep it in a safe every month, because you've got a backup copy then if something really bad happens. It's kind of the old photo albums. I have 40,000 digital pictures and I have 3,000 printed pictures. If I lose my computer, what have I got left? 3,000 printed computers.
And that's a tough question for people to answer, and it comes down to I wouldn't want to be anybody, and I wouldn't want to be in that position, or I had to make that choice whether I pay the ransomware or not. And in many cases, they're getting more sophisticated too, and it's about like they do the research and they gather information not about just your systems that they can encrypt, but also your personal information, your life, your family members, and they start to hold that ransom, and then it becomes a personal attack as opposed to that. And so some people are paying that to avoid disclosing any sensitive information. Others are, well, it's a cost of doing business. I can afford it. I'll pay it. I'll be back in business tomorrow and keep going. There's always a risk that you're not going to get the encryption key, and you're still going to have to do the recovery and the recovery costs. Sometimes cyber insurance will cover and mitigate the cost of the damages. From what I understand, it's even though you get that big paycheck because you had insurance, the costs are greater, and the time and loss of reputation and everything else is far more damaging to an organization. So it is a difficult choice to make if anybody's put in that position. I know organizations that have paid the ransom and got their business back up and running. Others have dug in deep and spent weeks or months recovering, and just hope for the best and recover their businesses. It's an unfortunate event, both from a business perspective and a personal perspective.
Yeah. So it goes back to being proactive. If you can be proactive and hopefully mitigate a lot of the avenues in, then it saves you in the long run.
Just sort of emphasize and personalize what you're just saying, Walter. I received a letter from a service provider yesterday, and I will make all efforts to keep the name confidential and not give you too many details, but they write to me and say, in January of this year, we identified our systems had been affected by a form of ransomware, which encrypted some of our data, making it inaccessible to us. When we learned of this incident, we immediately took steps to secure systems, commenced an investigation, securely restored data with the assistance of independent cybersecurity experts, somebody like yourselves. We have recently completed a comprehensive and time-consuming forensic investigation with our third-party experts to determine whether any personal information was affected by this incident, and they assure me that it wasn't. So we're safe, and we encourage you to remain vigilant against incidents of identity theft and fraud, review your account statements, monitor your credit reports for suspicious activity, and report any incidents of suspected identity theft to law enforcement. So my point in telling this story is that they're writing and saying, in January, we identified this. In November, they are still dealing with it. So the amount of time and effort and the financial aspects of this are absolutely frightening. So nothing like an ounce of protection or prevention. And so I'd urge our viewers to look into this, look into multi-factor authentication, seek professional assistance, find somebody with experience who's been down these roads before. Loved your story about parking kiosks. That reveals some of the stuff that goes on. Walter, I wanted to confirm with you, the podcast is Darknet Diaries.
Darknet Diaries.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ron, Pond, is that a URL, PWND?
Yeah, exactly.
It's sometimes pronounced pwned.
Yeah.
And pwned is means password owned.
Thank you.
That's what it's abbreviation for. So is your password owned? Does somebody own you? And so the terminology is I've pwned somebody is now you own them. You own them because you have all their credentials and you can access everything and you can do anything. So hackers will do that. And so all of these breaches have been collected, and there's millions and millions of accounts that have been breached. In fact, it's if you're diligent enough and you know what you're doing, you can actually access that information because, again, it's been placed on repositories that can be downloaded. Also, a lot of the password managers today, if you were subscribed to a password manager or to use a single sign-on if your business is doing something like that, when you are doing now the new standards out there for the National Institution of Standards and Technology, or NIST, is that verifying your password. So if you're entering a new password into the system, it'll say, hey, this password is a weak password. You can't use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Or this password has been pwned. Do not use this password because it's already been used and it's out there in the public on the dark web, and you're taking a huge risk by picking those choices.
Gentlemen, equal parts entertaining, frightening, and educational, for sure. I hope that we've helped some folks. For those of you who want to share this, it'll be on our YouTube channel later today, and pass it around. Let people learn and understand and protect themselves, because it's a scary world out there. So thanks very much. Our next event is November 17th with Isabelle Mercier-Turcotte. Many of you have watched her webinars with us before. It's part of a series called Inspiration and Motivation. And Isabelle is great at giving that. November 17th, it's up on our events calendar already. You can get your registration in. Ron, Walter, thanks again. Probably be seeing you again in a few months. So look forward to that. Thanks.
Anytime.
Thanks very much.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.